The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I don't know if you've been following the Jade Helm training exercises in several states in the U.S. South. I haven't really been talking about it too much because I thought of it as mostly just yet another insane right-wing conspiracy theory, but it's actually getting pretty serious what's going down down there. If you haven't heard of Jade Helm, it's a multi-state military training exercise which has sparked a ton of conspiracy theories, which have gained so much traction that the Pentagon actually made a statement saying we're not planning to invade Texas. And Texas Governor Greg Abbott actually went as far as calling in the Texas State Guard to monitor the exercises. And I'll give you a list of some of the conspiracy theories that the usual suspects, right? The extreme right, the so-called libertarians who believe that the federal government is oppressive, people like Alex Jones, the usual suspects, like I said, have been working on this subject in a way that has generated all of the following conspiracy theories. One, the Jade Helm training exercises are cover for the implementation of martial law from President Obama. Or, the Department of Justice and the United Nations plan to seize all of Americans' guns. That's a popular one. That's been used for everything from Sandy Hook to military training exercises. Number three, the military plans to imprison political dissidents. Why they would be doing these exercises only in some states in order to achieve that goal, I have no idea. The military plans to eliminate citizens who have made a particular list dubbed the Red List. Or, this is a combination conspiracy theory, in some of the states where the training exercises are going on, some Walmarts have been shuttered. And the conspiracy theory is that the military has occupied the shuttered Walmarts. And lastly, that this operation is coinciding with a false flag economic collapse meant to serve as a pretext for the federal government to do who knows what, and thus these federal troops will be ready to do whatever they need to do in reaction to this false flag economic collapse. Now, if this were all that was going on, if it were just some conspiracy theories from the right, wouldn't really be that big of a deal. But it has led to actual gunfire from U.S. citizens. For the second time this week, a gunman opened fire at Camp Shelby, which is a military training center that's just one piece of this Jade Helm training exercise. A man matching the same description as Tuesday's shooter, white, driving a red or maroon pickup truck, opened fire around 8 a.m. Wednesday for a second time, according to the Clarion Ledger. No immediate reports of injuries. On Tuesday, a gunman fired at two soldiers who were training at Camp Shelby. Two men were taken into custody and questioned, then released without charges. The truck seen Tuesday had the words "Broken Arrow" on the windshield. Broken Arrow is this military code for requesting help when you're being overrun by enemy forces. Think about that for a second. No one injured Tuesday. And then we have this other incident Wednesday of gunfire. And this is not really being reported by corporate media, a report here or there. If this is not domestic terrorism, right? If you see individuals taking up arms to go and fire where the military is conducting training exercises, this is domestic terrorism. It just so happens the alleged perpetrators are white, and it just so happens, as usual, we're not hearing much of it from corporate media. Don't the conspiracy theorists and fearmongers need to be held responsible, maybe not legally, but in general for the paranoia that has led to these types of actions? You would think that these alleged shooters wouldn't say, oh, you know what, Jade Helm 15 military exercises. Yeah, Alex Jones hasn't been talking about it. The right hasn't been talking about it. There's been no fear-mongering about it. I think I'm going to grab my gun and go shoot there. Of course not. So legal responsibility is not what I'm talking about. But how can we ignore that this conspiratorial mindset around Jade Helm has been sowed by many of the usual suspects that I listed just a few minutes ago? Fox News host Todd Starnes was on Allman in the Morning 2 days ago. It's a KFTK show. And he decided to talk a little bit about the upcoming Republican primary debate, which is, of course, tonight, and we'll be covering extensively on tomorrow's show. And he compared Jeb Bush to a metrosexual purse dog. Let's take a listen to what Todd Starnes had to say.
And Jamie, I may not be the brightest bulb in the lava lamp, but
Right.
on the day that Trump announced, I came out with a commentary that aired all across the country that said, "Do not underestimate Donald Trump." This is the guy who is saying what the American working man and American working woman want to hear. And here it is in a nutshell. And I get what Jeb Bush is doing. Everybody's trying to be the kinder, gentler, the compassionate conservative. But you know what, Jamie? The average American, they don't want one of those metrosexual purse dogs. They want a pit bull in the White House.
Yeah, and
Right. Super offensive to pit bulls, by the way, I have to say. So if I understand Todd Starnes correctly, Donald Trump saying the incredibly heinous and offensive things that other candidates have the common sense not to say is being rewarded by Republican voters so far. Dogs are led around on leashes. Humans clean up after them when they go to the bathroom. And Todd Starnes thinks Americans want a type of dog as president. I was thinking when I started hearing these types of clips that Fox News can't be in the tank for the right and equally support all of the insane Republican candidates, right? At some point, Fox News is going to have to pick their candidates. And it seems like maybe it's slightly starting to happen. And Fox News so far, I'm noticing an anti-Jeb trend. This time just straight up using metrosexual as an insult. Why is that even an insult, right? I mean, why are people on the right, like Todd Starnes, so terrified of metrosexuals? Are they afraid of anything that doesn't fit their typical, stereotypical definition of manhood? Because remember, back in 2004, the right was also saying, oh, John Kerry is this metrosexual elitist who speaks French, blah, blah, blah. Of course, the irony was that John Kerry was a Vietnam veteran with medals, and the people making these accusations often were not, other than those Swiftboat Veterans for Peace or whatever it was, which was a complete front group, very, very well-funded AstroTurf posing as grassroots. But that I digress. So last thought on this. Calling candidates out in general for their lack of manliness is such a weak and flaccid criticism, but there's a significant portion of the electorate on the Republican primary side that seems to really react strongly to those types of insults. And interestingly enough, we've talked about how that tends to fit in with other areas of conservative ideology. And there seems to be this pretty neat package of ideas that fits together. And being very concerned about the lack of manliness of candidates is certainly something that goes along with it. Hey, we've talked about when we have prayer in a public setting, you can't discriminate between prayer for one religion or another when we're talking about government-sanctioned prayer, which we shouldn't have anyway. The Lincoln County Board of Commissioners always open their government meetings with Christian prayer. And a couple of months ago, officials decided, that's a little bit questionable legally. We have to let anyone who wants to participate in this prayer participate with whatever type of prayer suits them or corresponds with their faith. This didn't last very long, as Raw Story is reporting. Earlier this week, Commission Chairman Carrol Mitchem, who previously announced that he wouldn't, quote, bow to minorities and that he, quote, ain't gonna have no new religion or pray to Allah at board meetings, held completely true to his word and walked out on the first person to address the North Carolina government meeting with a Muslim prayer. Dustin Bardo of the Foothills Interfaith Assembly, who was leading the Muslim prayer, said, quote, that was very upsetting. It was upsetting. And by the end of the meeting, all prayer ended up being banned at board meetings and will be replaced with a moment of silence. Commissioner Alex Patton initiated the motion, which was easily voted into effect. Doesn't a moment of silence make a lot more sense? And I'll tell you two reasons why. Number one, a moment of silence is not an establishment of religion in any way by the government. And religion should be separate from the government and from government meetings. But number two, it avoids anybody being offended by the place of some other religion in the meeting. Anybody can, in their mind, pray to whoever their God is, and nobody knows. And it just makes everything much more smooth. And this issue of prayer at government meetings is really starting to take on sort of delusional, paranoid vibes. Previously, Mitchem vowed to keep Christian-only prayer at meetings. So proactively saying, we just are going to have, we're going to have prayer, but it's going to be just one type of prayer, saying, quote, I don't believe we need to be bowing to the minorities. The U.S. and the Constitution were founded on Christianity. This is what the majority of people believe in, and it's what I'm standing up for. Carrol Mitchem is clearly proof that evolution can go in reverse. I don't think that with Carrol Mitchem, the elevator goes to the top floor, if you know what I mean. Why do we even need prayer at meetings, right? Pray at home, pray with your family, pray at your church with other people who share your faith. At the meeting, just get down to business. We want religious freedom, and we hear from these individuals on the right that they want religious freedom, but it always ends up being for their religion only. And if we can just get rid of prayer at public government meetings, which we shouldn't have anyway, explain to me why we have prayer at a public government meeting, then you can resolve this problem. I'm against prayer in these government meetings, but if we're going to be able to handle Christian prayers at such a meeting, then we need to be able to handle Muslim prayers or Jewish prayers or an atheistic invocation of some kind or whatever. It needs to all be okay. People like Mitchem are the epitome of the religious freedom hypocrites that we've been covering on this show year after year. And this guy publicly showing himself to be the hypocrite that we know him to be.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show is not like a lot of other programs you may watch or be aware of. We're funded directly by our audience through something called the David Pakman Show membership program, where you can read more about, which you can read more about at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's new member of the day is Albert Candelaria. Albert, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. And let me remind everybody that tomorrow, Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be doing an email blast with a huge membership discount. If you like the idea of getting the bonus show, which is an extra show we do every day just for our subscribers, if you like the idea of instead of 3-minute YouTube clips, getting the full hour show minus the commercials, if you like the idea of a members-only podcast feed that you can put on your phone or your computer or your iPad or wherever that gives you the bonus show and our full hour podcast minus the commercials, but you're worried about the cost, this is the opportunity to get a membership at a big discount. All you have to do to be notified about this membership discount is be on our newsletter list. Go to davidpakman.com. On the left side of the page, you'll see a little box where you can sign up for our newsletter. Sign up, and tomorrow, Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, you will get an email with a code to sign up for membership. It's a big discount. It's so big, I don't even want to say what it is. I have a great documentary recommendation today. It's called The True Cost, and it was actually recommended to me by a couple of our viewers. And it's about conditions created by or related to the fashion industry. And most people have heard, oh, we've heard of sweatshops in Asia where our clothes are being produced. But number one, as far as the conditions go, even I was surprised, and I've studied this a little bit, even I was surprised by the conditions outlined by the film. But it also goes well beyond just the sweatshop working conditions. It does talk about human rights and the sweatshop conditions are part of that. But the film also talks about the environmental impact of the fashion industry and of the increasingly popular fast fashion world. And it also talks about the economic impact of the fashion world. And some great experts make appearances in the film. One is our friend Richard Wolff, economist Richard Wolff, who I will be interviewing a little bit later today. He's in the film, The True Cost, and also former guest Tansy Hoskins, who we've interviewed, who wrote a great book about the problems in the fashion industry. They both appear in the film. I really think you should take a look at this one. It's on Netflix. It's available elsewhere also. It is called The True Cost, about the human rights, economic, and environmental impact of the fashion industry. Vice is reporting that Canada's armed forces have purchased radar technology that is part of Israel's famous Iron Dome, which is the missile system that can shoot down Hamas and Hezbollah rockets, and they plan to deploy the system within Canada. Quote from the Defense Minister, Jason Kenney, "Our troops deserve the best, and that's why we're purchasing the Israeli radar technology behind the Iron Dome." So this is a really key distinction. People have been emailing me saying, David, the Iron Dome system can only shoot down rockets or kind of fly next to and then explode other rockets when you're at a much smaller distance away than Canada is from, for example, Russia. And that's absolutely true. And the key here is that they have purchased the radar technology that is part of the Iron Dome system. They are not going to be using the entire Iron Dome system. It is specifically the radar part of it. And there's an expected delivery of 2017. And Canada may well use these systems in the far north of Canada where they are close to Russia. Vladimir Putin recently announcing a huge defense spending program to modernize their military by 2020. Part of that involves upgrading military infrastructure in the Arctic, for example, new missile systems, new icebreakers, drone fleets, etc. And Canada may well be saying, well, this is going to be the best radar system to determine if there is Russian intrusion into Canadian airspace. Also, there's this other interesting thing that our audience probably has no idea about. I had no idea about it until I started researching the story. There are NATO spending requirements, military spending requirements. NATO nations are required in principle to spend a certain amount on the military. This, by the way, tells us a lot about the underlying framework of the military-industrial complex, right? Mandatory spending requirements. And a couple people emailed me saying, you know, David, it may be that Canada is doing this to meet the NATO military spending requirements. That may be, but they're not strongly enforced requirements, and Canada hasn't met the NATO spending requirements in almost a decade. In fact, there are very few countries that meet the military spending requirements that are put in place by NATO. So Canada, I think what a lot of our audience was reacting to is the idea that we think of Canada as very non-controversial and non-militarized and not really engaged in the fear-mongering, war-hawking back and forth that we see with the jousting that many other countries are involved in. However, there are some very specific reasons, including the recent comments and decisions made by Russia, for which Canada would say, well, let's at least get the radar technology from the Israeli Iron Dome system. If I'm missing a possible motivation here for Canada's decision, please email me by all means, and we will definitely update the story. The Guardian is reporting that Airbus, one of the two biggest aircraft manufacturers in the world, of course, Airbus and Boeing, the two biggest ones, Airbus has secured a patent for a new type of hypersonic passenger plane. Now, you may remember the Concorde, British Airways flying the Concorde from the US to London, and I believe also to Paris for many, many years, a supersonic aircraft, and it was since retired. And now Airbus has secured a patent for a much, much faster hypersonic passenger plane. But Airbus is being very clear that the design is not likely to be a flyable plane anytime soon. To give you a sense of the speed we're talking about, the proposed technology, the patented technology, would reduce the travel time from Paris to Tokyo from 12 hours to just under 3 hours. And the idea, which is about 4 years old in terms of sort of more official publishing, but people have been talking about it for much longer than that, is to equip the airplane with 3 different kinds of engines to jump above the atmosphere, but still being able to use regular runways for takeoff and landing. The idea is you take off with a sort of as a normal plane, and then you use rocket boosters to create a sharper ascent, almost a vertical climb, sending the plane over the atmosphere. Ramjet engines, which are currently used in missiles, would then take the plane up to an altitude of about 18 miles at speeds up to 3,400 miles per hour, or 4.5 times the speed of sound. And then the turbojets would reignite to enable a regular type of landing. There was a similar proposal back in 2011. And at the time, Airbus said, we're probably looking at 30 to 40 years before planes like this would be in service. This is not the only hypersonic project Airbus has going. They have several projects, one with Japanese partners. They have another with Russian and Australian involvement. And the idea is eventually to achieve speeds of Mach 6, or 6 times the speed of sound. Air travel hasn't been sped up really for a long time. It's actually been slowed down slightly on certain routes in order to increase fuel efficiency. And what's going on right now, if I, as many others, I'm sure have been wondering, it's been so long and air travel hasn't gotten any faster. In fact, it's gotten a little slower in some cases. What we're dealing with right now is that with the sort of paradigm of fuselage and wing design and turbine engines, adding speed now significantly increases fuel consumption, and thus it would increase the cost of tickets. So, for example, would it be worth it to you to pay 50% more to go 20% faster? And to give you a specific example of what this would be like, right now, flying from Boston to Paris takes about 6 hours and 15 minutes. Let's say that ticket is, at some time between peak season and off-peak, an $800 ticket. 6 hours and 15 minutes, $800. Would it be worth it to you to pay $1,200 instead of $800 to get to Paris in 5 hours instead of 6 hours and 15 minutes? Is that a worthwhile trade-off? For me, it's probably not. In fact, when I do those shorter flights to Europe, I almost wish they were a little longer so that I would have more time to try to get a few hours of sleep. So for me, an extra $400 to cut an hour and 15 minutes off of a trip from Boston to Paris wouldn't be worth it. And this ignores the environmental impact of speeding up air travel sort of within the current paradigm with the current technology. So we're going to have to wait for a paradigm shift conceptually before we see air travel sped up. And an interesting conversation I've had with people is some people seem to think that if air travel were faster, jet lag wouldn't be as bad. I'm not actually convinced of that, because the time change would still happen. You would have fewer hours on the plane during which to maybe rest. I don't know that jet lag would actually be any better if planes were able to travel faster. I guess you would get to your destination sooner and be able to start adjusting to the local schedule marginally faster. I'm not sure, but send me your thoughts on that. If we were able to speed up air travel, would jet lag not be as bad? After the break, we will talk to economist Richard Wolff. Bernie Sanders. Is he a socialist? What does that mean? And are socialistic ideas more popular or less popular today than they were 20, 30, or 40 years ago? This is the expert on the topic. Economist Richard Wolff will join me next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by economist Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. Professor Wolff, it's so great to have you on, and we have now a very interesting situation with the candidacy of Bernie Sanders for president of the United States, where we're hearing so much in terms of the term socialism being thrown about. And there's sort of two different elements that I want to unpack with you here today. The first being, is the term socialist really appropriate when we analyze the policy positions of Bernie Sanders? And number two, the idea that many of the ideas that may fall under the umbrella of socialistic are increasingly popular in the United States. Let's start with the first issue. When you do an analysis of Bernie Sanders' positions, is there a general label of socialist that could be accurately applied?
Well, the answer to that question requires a few minutes, I'll be brief, I promise, about what socialism is.
Right.
The problem is that, like its ego, its other, if you like, capitalism, it is defined in different ways by different people at different times. So you just have to understand that the word socialism isn't some narrowly defined thing that everybody knows the meaning of and everybody has a pretty much similar definition. That's simply not the case. So to give you an example, by some definitions of socialism that had been embraced by many, yes, Bernie Sanders has a long socialist tradition. He is very skeptical, for example, of the behavior of private capitalist corporations. He insists that they are mostly driven by profits, something many of them admit anyway, and that in the course of pursuing maximum profits, they shortchange the environment, they shortchange the quality of life for their employees, and so on and so on and so on. And that when he totals up the costs of what capitalism doesn't take account of and weighs it against the benefits and notices that the benefits accrue chiefly to a relatively small part of the population and the costs to the majority, he ends up being a critic of capitalism and advocates for a change to what he calls socialism. And yes, that's something many people who have been called socialists have done. And by that standard, that's what he's in favor of.
Now, at the same time, if we consider the element of socialism which advocates for a sort of community or public ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, that could not be further from what Bernie Sanders is talking about.
That's right. He's in favor of one kind of socialism. By the way, it sometimes has adjectives like democratic socialism or social democracy and a variety of other such labels. Precisely these labels intended to distinguish it from other definitions of socialism, such as the one you've pointed to, where, and let me be blunt here, some notions of socialism basically say capitalism is about private ownership of the means of production, whereas socialism has the state doing that. So instead of there being private companies running the stores and the offices and the factories, it's instead government that does all that thing. And the second part of that older definition says that instead of letting the market determine who gets what, the government uses a plan to distribute resources and products in the way that planners think is appropriate. So another definition of socialism that Bernie Sanders clearly does not agree with is focused on government ownership instead of private and government planning instead of markets. And that would be the kind of socialism associated with the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Cuba, at least until recently. Cuba's changing and so on. But yes, so you have one kind of socialism that fits Bernie Sanders and another kind that does not.
Let's talk now a little bit about the palatability of some of the specific ideas that Bernie Sanders supports. I wrote a blog for Huffington Post about a month and a half ago where I pointed out that on many issues, Bernie Sanders, while framed as a sort of far-left extremist, actually represents the predominant view amongst Americans. So examples of this include, does the government have some basic duty to provide some level of health care to everybody, regardless of ability to pay? Bernie Sanders believes the answer is yes. Around 2/3 of Americans, when asked fairly, not when they say, should the government take over healthcare, but when they're asked fairly, agree with that. On questions of, should higher taxes be used on the very rich to reduce the income gap? That is a very positively polling question in general in the United States. Bernie Sanders agrees with that. And there are other examples. Do you find this to be a change recently in American society? Or do you think that Americans have just never really been asked very clearly about these ideas?
I guess my answer is neither of those. Let me tell you why I think. I think that many of the socialist ideas of the sort that Bernie Sanders is advocating have in fact been popular majority perspectives in the United States for most of its history. And that means the 19th century as well as the 20th century, as well as into our times. I don't think those perspectives were ever dismissed by the American people or that they turned against them. I think something very different happened. When the socialist movements in the United States got strong at the end of the 19th century, again in the 1930s, again in the 1960s, and now again, showing that it's a recurring phenomena, it sometimes got strong enough that you had a kind of reaction, a blowback, a notion on the part of the business community and people who like capitalism that they were indeed now threatened. And in response, they produced, quite effectively, by the way, programs to demonize socialism, to associate it with scary things, so that people would focus on another definition of socialism that they could be easily driven to not like, and kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater, forget or lose sight of all of those other parts of socialism and those other definitions that in fact had been very compatible. And by the way, this was always done in the same way. You were told that socialism was against religion. So if you believed in God, then socialism was your enemy. Or you were told that socialism was something coming from the outside, a foreign idea, so that if you were interested or supportive of it, you were in some sense disloyal or treasonous. Or you were told that it was all about violence. And if you didn't believe in violence, well, then you shouldn't be a socialist. These are classic scare tactics. We see them on display in our presidential campaigns as the candidates smear each other in every way they can think of. But here you had a concerted effort to demonize socialism, to define it in a way that made demonization easy. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, there has been no big enemy to sustain the idea that socialism has to do with somebody foreign in Russia or China who threatens you. And since capitalism itself has functioned so poorly in the last 20 years, creating such a divide between rich and poor, basically what you saw was the atrophy of the demonization of socialism and the rise of problems in capitalism that were bound sooner or later to take people back to all those socialist arguments, such as Bernie Sanders is making, that have been majority perspectives through most of this country's history.
Do you think that Occupy Wall Street, for all of the things that it did not do so well, did a very good job of bringing the topic of income inequality back to the forefront and sort of created an atmosphere where you could have more discussions about the failings of the status quo capitalist system?
Absolutely. I mean, if I were advising Bernie Sanders, I am not, but if I were advising Bernie Sanders, I would tell him that at some point he kind of owes it to the history of the United States to take his hat off and thank Occupy Wall Street, because it literally paved the way for what he is not now doing. They didn't know that, and he's not the fellow who has to answer to all of these things. But it is the case, because that was the first movement since the Cold War to be able to openly say, look, we're good Americans, we want the best for our country, and we think the inequality between rich and poor is the biggest threat to what the United States could and should be. And unlike others who, if they said anything about it in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, would get tarred with the brush. You're a communist, you love the Soviet Union, or go back to Russia, or all the silly things that were said. The Occupy Wall Street was the first one in almost half a century to say, no, we're not going to be shut up by that. We're going to speak what we think is a truth, the 1% versus the 99%. That changed the discourse. I mean, President Obama had to use that in his speeches only after Occupy Wall Street. He never did that before. And I think that changed the whole discussion and the culture of the United States, and absolutely helps explain why Bernie Sanders is drawing the interest he is, the huge audiences he is, and so on.
All right, we've been speaking with economist Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts. Thanks as always.
Thank you, David, and good luck, and I hope to talk with you again in the future.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
You might not have heard that gay marriages have been taking place at West Point Military Academy. And the first male same-sex couple to marry at West Point were in a Manhattan bodega in the Soho neighborhood over the weekend when one of them was physically attacked by a man that they say threw the first punch. As David Badash writes in the New Civil Rights Movement, Larry Lennox Choate III wrote on Facebook, "It's hard to believe that in 2015, we would have to deal with anti-gay hate crimes in Soho, of all places, but that's what happened today. An unidentified man of about 40 years of age screamed anti-gay obscenities at the couple and then punched Larry's husband, Daniel Lennox Choate, in the face. Larry, who graduated from West Point in 2009, explains, the guy who screamed anti-gay obscenities at us in a bodega before sucker punching Danny, he left covered in his own blood with his tail between his legs after I handled the situation and tossed him in the street like the coward loser he is. The Hate Crimes Division of the New York Police Department is on the case, and we have full faith in a positive outcome. We refuse to be victims and are thankful we can defend ourselves, but we're saddened by the fact that idiots like this guy might not pick two guys who went through plebby boxing next time." Daniel graduated from West Point in 2007. The couple were married in 2013. It's incredible to me that even in New York City, but not only in New York City, in Manhattan, but not only in Manhattan, in Soho, that we have this type of just open, homophobic gay bashing, right? Maybe if we say, well, what are the more conservative parts of New York City? Staten Island votes a little more conservatively. Maybe not that we would expect it, but maybe you would be less surprised by this type of virulent homophobia there. But in the liberal of the liberal of the liberal, that someone would be not only dumb enough, but also this hateful to start publicly shaming gays in this way. His sincerely held beliefs about gay people must have been so strong that he decided to abandon all logic and reason. And I would argue that by its very nature, homophobia is an abandonment of logic and reason. I've said this before and I've said it again. I can't really take anybody seriously if they're anti-gay. Could you take someone seriously if they thought that black people shouldn't be allowed to serve in the military, or that the earth is flat, or that praying for rain works? No matter how reasonable they sounded on car repair or computer technology or farming or whatever else, I would have a very hard time taking that person seriously with regard to anything. If they said, yeah, I just fundamentally don't think that gay people should have the same rights as others and think that being gay is a sin for which God will punish you and us as a society, I'm sorry. I just can't take anybody seriously who holds those views. Hey, we are starting to think a little bit about the next Olympic Games. I have been increasingly less interested in Olympics over the last few Olympic cycles, but we now have some news that might interest some new viewers. Flying disc sports, including ultimate frisbee, have been officially recognized by the International Olympic Committee. Disc-based games are played in 58 countries around the world by thousands of athletes, and the World Flying Disc Federation, the WFDF, if you haven't heard of them, said it was both honored and humbled by the International Olympic Committee's decision to grant full recognition. They say, quote, "It is an incredible milestone in the 30-year history of the WFDF." So this does not mean that ultimate frisbee is going to be an Olympic sport in any particular Olympic Games. This just means that it has been recognized as a sport within the realm of sports that the Olympics considers to be actual sports. And every Olympic Games, there's this whole lobbying effort for which sports should be in the Games. And there's been this controversy over the last few Olympic cycles with regard to wrestling. And we often hear from people, well, why is curling arbitrarily an Olympic sport and these 5 other sports are not? Although I find curling to be pretty interesting. I mean, sweeping ice, that's compelling stuff. There's no question about it. So this is very, very exciting for the frisbee community. And I'm actually curious, every time this happens, there is a huge level of anger every time a sport is removed from those which may be in the Olympic Games and a sport is added. If you look online at the discussions, people are just flipping out, so attached to a sport being or not being part of the roster of Olympic sports. I don't really understand why. And for example, I think soccer and basketball are definitely sports that are of the most popular and important and interesting sports to watch. If I was told, okay, soccer is not going to be an Olympic sport anymore, I'd say, okay, well, I guess that's fine. We still have the World Cup and the America Cup and all of the leagues. I wouldn't flip out as much as I love soccer. I love basketball, for example. If you were to tell me basketball is out from the Summer Olympics, okay, I guess I'd be disappointed because it's kind of cool to see the different teams compete. And, both the United States and Argentina, the 2 countries that I have a connection to, have done really well in basketball in the Olympics. I'm not going to lose my mind over it, right? Explain to me, and I welcome some explanation, why such a strong emotional attachment to the inclusion of or removal of particular sports from the Olympic Games? And what do you think about the inclusion of disc sports like ultimate frisbee as possible Olympic sports? We have a voicemail number if you want to call any time of day. 219-2-DAVID-P is the number. Let's take a listen to a voicemail I got.
Hi, this show is the frickin' bomb, frickin.com. And I want this voicemail to air so much. I mean, so much. I would give you $1 million if you air this. Thank you. I love you. Bye.
Here's my question. How old do you think that caller is? I really can't tell. Sometimes callers say, this is my age or that's my age, and we've gotten calls from very young callers in the past. This particular caller doesn't say. How old do you think that caller is? And you can keep the $1 million. We played the voicemail. Glad to do it. Thanks for the compliments. On today's bonus show, today's the last day we will be checking in with Lewis from the road on his epic journey from the state of Texas back to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the eventual joining of the David Pakman Show in our future new home of Boston, Massachusetts. We will talk to Lewis. I would guess that at this point, we'll call him once we start the bonus show, he's probably past Washington, D.C. by now and is really legitimately in the Northeast by now. So we will talk about that. We will preview tonight's Republican presidential debate and talk about a few other things. Bonus show every day, davidpakman.com/membership. And remember, tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, we're sending out an email with a huge membership discount. If you want to be notified of that, just sign up for our newsletter at davidpakman.com. Left side of the page, type in your email address. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., you will be notified about this great membership special that we're running.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.